welcome. Today I've got the massive privilege of talking to the scholar whose work has impacted my own work and life, probably more than anyone else. So he's going to feel slightly embarrassed. This is David Smith, whose book Mission After Christendom really started me thinking about the role of mission agencies and what mission should look like. And then his follow-up Against the Stream pushed me further down the line, and my life's never been the same again. So I'm very grateful to you, David, for providing direction. But we're not here to talk about you. We're going to be talking about Professor Andrew Walls, who you knew very well, who went to be with his Lord last week. But before we talk about Andrew, and I've embarrassed you slightly, could you just tell us something about yourself and your background?
I can, Eddie. But first of all, my thanks to you for asking me to do this, both in terms of connecting with you, which is a privilege. I'm humbled by your statement about my work. I have great admiration for your own work, and it's just fantastic to be able to have this interaction together. But I'm also immensely grateful that you have asked me to say something about Andrew Walls, because he's someone who has had an enormous impact on my own life, and I honor his memory, and I'm very happy to share a little of what my experience of him has been. And actually, it kind of interweaves, as I've already implied, with my own story. My pilgrimage in terms of ministry begins in Cambridge. I was for 11 years pastor of Eden Chapel, and was immensely privileged and blessed to be ministering in that centre of learning. And towards the end of that 11 years, just felt my spirit deeply, deeply stirred by Africa. The growth of the African church and a kind of Macedonian cry for help in the area of training for ministry. So I sailed for the southeast of Nigeria in a Nigerian cargo ship with my wife, Joyce, and 2 small children, and spent 6 years in the southeast of Nigeria. And many folk listening to this will identify with this, but it was really like a second conversion.
Yes.
Because it just raised so many issues for me, many of which I had no answers. The issues that I was struggling with just didn't fit anywhere within the systematic theology that I had taken to Africa. So toward the end of that period, we felt we had to return reluctantly because of the boys' education. And I was really struggling with how to come back to Britain with all of these new questions to which I had no real answers. And I had just come across some of the work of Andrew Walls. I mean, he had taught at the University of Nsukka, which was pretty close to where we were located. I never met him, but I just had come across some of his work. And I began to think if there was a way of getting to Aberdeen University to study with him, I would be so thankful for that. My wife Joyce was very reluctant to face the thought of coming from the tropics to a winter in the northeast of Scotland. And the way in which it happened, I mean, I can't go into the details, but one day I was in Port Harcourt trying to get an air conditioner through Nigerian customs for a leprosy hospital, and the air conditioner was on a banned list of imports in Nigeria. So what should have been straightforward was stretching over about 3 or 4 days, kind of thing that you'll be familiar with.
Oh yes.
And I met a young American who told me that he was trying to get a specially adapted motor car for his disabled wife through the customs. And we got talking, as you do, about, you know, where you've come from, where you're going. And I mentioned Aberdeen, and
Yes.
his interest suddenly accelerated. And he asked me what department I was interested in, and I said religious studies. And he said, well, that's remarkable, because I happen to be married to Andrew Wall's daughter. So that kind of overcame my wife's fears about going back to Aberdeen, because
Yes.
as she said, we're never going to get any clearer guidance than that.
No.
So we, long story, but we ended up being able to go to Aberdeen. It was a time when local council still had the funds to not only pay your fees, but also give you a living allowance. And I did a 3-year master's degree in religious studies.
Right.
I'd got my theological foundation, but I wanted to wrestle with the religious questions.
Yes.
And Andrew had founded the Department of Religious Studies in Aberdeen. And I went up to meet him. I remember him taking me up to the refectory for lunch, and on the stairs going up, I thought, this man is not going to be with us for very long. He was so breathless. He had a major heart problem. But he enabled me to get access to the university and go through that 3 years
Yes.
of a master's degree with him teaching. And then I was going to do research with him as my supervisor. But his heart problems, which I'd seen from the beginning, became very acute. And he had multiple bypass surgery. So I had to move in a different direction. But that surgery gave him a new lease of life.
Yes.
I would never have believed when I first met him that he would have lived into his 90s and continued to be so active as he was. So that was an enormous blessing to me. And then very quickly, Eddie, I became principal of Northumbria Bible College in Berwick-on-Tweed. I'm not sure whether that's when we may have had the first contact. Then that went through a process of merger to form International College Christian College in Glasgow.
Yeah.
And I moved on to Oxford, and I was working with David Cook at the Whitfield Institute for 4 years. When that closed, the new International Christian College in Glasgow came calling and asked if I would help develop a master's course in urban mission. So here I am in Glasgow, now retired, still active in teaching. I've got a link with Aberdeen University.
Oh, excellent.
I'm doing some supervision there, and I'm trying to continue writing.
Actually, the first time I came across you, it wouldn't have been mutual, was shortly after you went to Nigeria. I went to Cambridge on a university placement and attended Eden.
Well, my goodness.
I remember praying for you. So that would be back in 1980, I think.
Well, bless you. That's amazing.
We've mentioned Andrew Walls and mentioned that he supervised you and that you were inspired by him. But could you just give us some background who he is for those who don't know? Just sort of some background to his life and his work.
Yes. Very much a Scot, a Methodist by background and by conviction. Attended the Methodist Church in Aberdeen and preached on that circuit for many, many years. It's interesting that because it's another side to Andrew. You know, you think of this great academic and teacher, but he was very much rooted in reality in terms of the life of the church. And I just pulled out some of his work in advance of this conversation, and I was reminded of something that one of the people who writes about him says, that not only did he preach in the Methodist circuit, but he wrote a series of hymns to be sung in Methodist churches. And I've just read through a few of them, and they're really fine poetry, but also, again, very down to earth, very much thinking of the needs of the congregation. He, as I briefly mentioned, he's basically a historian. I mean,
yes.
in history, he's a historian to his fingertips. And it's interesting looking at the few books that he published. They all have history in the title. So everything that comes out of his work is based on a historical perspective. And he knew, for instance, the history of the early church in the first 300 years extremely well. And it played a big part in his thinking when he found himself in Sierra Leone and suddenly realized that the kind of things that he saw going on around him made sense of what had previously been a great mystery in terms of what happened in those first 300 years. And he found himself making a connection between, if you like, primal societies in Africa and Christianity in that context, and the wrestling with the translation of the gospel from the Jewish to the Hellenist context in the first 300 years. He was a brilliant teacher. He was a wonderful human being, and he was a very devout disciple of Jesus Christ. And I think my memory of him is this rare combination of someone immensely erudite and just incredibly humble. He carried this great learning very lightly. When I was sitting my final exams in Aberdeen, he suddenly appeared as I was standing outside the examination room and put an envelope in my hand. And when I got inside and sat down, just about to start writing the first of 9 papers, I opened this card in which he said, "Just to let you know that I'm praying for you this morning." Well, there are not too many academics who support their students in that way, and it really describes the man perfectly.
That's lovely. So could you highlight some of the sort of significant contributions he's made to Christian thought and to theology?
Yes, I can, Eddie. I mean, it's with somebody like this, it's really difficult to sort of just encapsulate it, because the thought is so rich and it ranges over such an enormous area of concern. But in advance of this conversation, I just jotted down 4 phrases, and they're all phrases or ideas of his, which he published very little, 2 books out of a life of 90 years was so rich and so full, and so helpful.
A green one and a yellow one.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The missionary movement in Christian history and the cross-cultural process in the same. So these 4 points are things that he developed at considerable length, but they illustrate both his faithfulness to the Bible, but also his creativity, his status as, I think, a genuinely original thinker. And the first one, which is probably the best known one, is the phrase, the Ephesian moment. So he talks about this brief period in the first century when 2 previously mutually hostile cultures come together, and the dividing wall is broken down by the cross. And folk, if they're not familiar with his work, folk need to go to that lecture and just read the way in which he develops the centrality of that massive moment of reconciliation. You were talking to Peter a couple of weeks ago, I think, who's also focused a great deal on the crucial significance of reconciliation at the heart of the gospel. And Andrew says not only that that was crucial to what the gospel achieved in the first century, but then he says, we live at a time when that Ephesian movement has suddenly returned once again.
Yes.
And in the growth of world Christianity, we have the possibility of a repeat of that reconciliation, but this time not between two cultures, but in relation to many cultures that are now penetrated by the gospel and the lordship of Jesus Christ. And that then leads him on to say that the crucial issues of the future will be ecumenical. Will the return of the Ephesian moment provide the opportunity for the healing of the divisions of the Christian movement, or will it simply be that once again we fragment and fail to grasp the opportunity to show the world a new way of being a human family? So I think that would be the first of his great insights that I would emphasize. I think the second one, which would be very important to you, Eddie, is the phrase, the infinite translatability of the gospel. That and again, you know, I can only just point towards where these thoughts are developed and urge people to read them if they haven't done so. He says this is the essence of the gospel, and he traces it back to the incarnation, that God, in a sense, made this great translation on our behalf, and as the result of that, the gospel is forever possible of translation into ever new cultural and linguistic contexts. He contrasts this with Islam, where the sacred is locked into a single language and in essence is not translatable. And that this is what makes the gospel so exciting and so wonderful. And that kind of leads me to the third thing, which is his insistence that there are two fundamental principles that shape the history of Christianity and of the church. And they are both important and they need to be held together in tension. One he calls the indigenizing principle. So the church is a place to be at home. Christ is the savior of my world and he speaks my language. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with folk in Northeast India, where the crucial issue is identity. You know, who are we in this context in which we find ourselves in a nation that is overwhelmingly Hindu, and that is bringing increasing pressures on other traditions. We've lost our culture, partly as the result of mission, and so we don't know who we are, and we wrestle with this. So in those sorts of contexts, within a globalized world are very widespread, the indigenizing principle is crucially important. But then Andrew says there's another balancing principle, which he calls the pilgrim principle. So here we have no ultimate home. We're on a journey. And our ultimate values come from our identity as a pilgrim people on the way to the ultimate transformation. And again, that balancing of the two, he says, is so crucially important that if you only talk about indigenization, you end up with a culture-bound form of Christianity. If you only talk about the pilgrim principle, you're focused on heaven, but you're not really of any earthly help or value. And then the last one, Eddie, which for me has been, I think, the most important of all, is the distinction he makes between conversion and proselytism. And he says that in the New Testament, there was a form of becoming Jewish that involved proselytization. So you, as a Gentile, you could become a Jew.
Yeah.
But in the process, you became something different from what you were previously. So you adopted the law of Moses, you adopted everything that was required within the tradition of the synagogue. You effectively became Jewish.
Yeah.
And Andrew says it's amazing that the apostles, being Jews as they were, and the early church being Jewish, but it didn't follow that model. Instead, it developed a concept of conversion, which involved radical change and belonging to a new community, but not in such a way that you had to abandon everything in your previous identity. And this has, to me, been an enormously important insight. And I think it's one of his most valuable contributions to the missionary movement. Because my feeling is, and you might want to come back on this, Eddie, but my feeling is that mission has always talked about conversion, but I think very often what's actually happened has been proselytization. And we've made Christians in our image. Was one of those things that I really wrestled with in Nigeria, because I could see the way in which the form of Christianity that was being adopted there was not really authentic in many cases, because it involved a complete change of identity to become like those who had brought the message.
Yeah.
So Andrew's discussion of conversion and proselytism has been immensely rich and enormously helpful and very, very applicable to missiological practice.
Would you say it's applicable to the situation in the UK? In my experience as someone who grew up in a council estate in Sunderland, is that really in order to be a Christian, I had to become middle class. Somewhere along the line, my accent has gone, and when I am Northern, people laugh at me.
Really?
Yeah.
That's tragic. No, I think that's absolutely true. And maybe in an even wider sense than that, you know, in terms of local cultural identities, that's an issue.
Yeah.
But also, I think, in terms of the wider issues of modernist culture, you know, I think we've a real challenge to ask the question: how do we translate the gospel in the context of this culture? And that might involve for us some really difficult questions that we would find really disturbing.
Yes.
Because we might find that sort of areas that we've regarded as sacrosanct, we have to do a bit of rethinking. I mean, recently I've been wrestling with this issue of lament in the Bible.
Yes.
As you probably know. And
I just pause there to say I will link to David's excellent book on lament, Stumbling Towards Zion, in the notes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Eddie. Thank you.
I'll take 10% on any sales.
You're most welcome. Yeah, I mean, I think wrestling with that issue of lament has made me think a lot about the doctrine of God, you know, and divine omnipotence, and all of those omnis that we've traditionally talked about. And I don't want to deny that. I don't want to devalue a traditional understanding of God and of theology. But I think in a world that is as broken and filled with pain and trauma as ours is, there is a question about whether we have properly understood the pathos of God, the identification of God, with human suffering and pain and loss. So that, yeah, that would be my own thinking in terms of some of the things that Andrew has said.
One of the
there's one other thing, Eddie. There's one other thing about just, you know, in terms of Andrew's contribution. He has this wonderful lecture in which he talks about a visitor from outer space,
yes,
who comes to visit Earth 5 times at different periods through 2,000 years. And each time he encounters a group of Christians, but they all look terribly different.
yes,
And he recognizes they have something that unites them, that is fundamentally important. And yet in their appearance and in their practices, it's hard to see that they really relate to each other.
yeah.
And he connects this with the various phases in Christian history in which the gospel has been translated into a new
Yes.
cultural context and taken off, even as it was declining in the one in which it had previously been dominant. That's a wonderful lecture, I think, and just full of enormous riches as we think on the history of the Christian movement.
That's the gospel as prisoner and liberator of culture. Is that the one?
That's the one.
Yes,
that's the one.
I link to that below as well.
Very good.
One thing that I'm very much struck by in Andrew's work is his, it moves on from what you were just saying there, his picture of Christian growth as being serial, of that the church declines at the center and grows from the margins. And so that areas which were once Christian are no longer, say, North Africa. And he contrasts this with Islam, which grows from the center. And once somewhere becomes Islamic, it tends to stay that way, unless by violence Islam is expelled, such as in Spain. And in order to keep growing, the church has to cross cultural boundaries. I was just wondering, as someone has thought a lot about urban mission and has taught on that, and we appear to be living in one of those phases where an area which was the center of the Christian faith, the North Atlantic, Christianity seems to be declining while growing elsewhere. Are there any lessons or things that we in the church in the UK need to learn from Andrew's work in that area? I haven't warned you about that question.
No, that's okay. That's fine. That's fine. Well, I mean, I suppose that living through such a period is really hard. I find it really difficult when I go into the center of Glasgow and I see all these massive church buildings that were erected in the Victorian period and were filled, you know, they were overflowing. And now they've mainly been converted into other uses. That's hard, you know, it's really hard to see that. It's even harder, I think, when I mean, I'm quite close to a secondary school here, and often as I walk to the newspaper shop in the morning to pick up my Guardian,
other newspapers are available.
I just pass groups of young people, and they make me really sad. You know, I can overhear parts of the conversation, and I think, what a tragedy for a generation that grows up without foundations for life. And I really fear for them and fear for the future. So there's great pain in that. But I think also, you know, one has to see the purpose of God in this. I think ask questions about how we got here. What has gone wrong with us that we're in this situation? And I've got a quotation from Andrew, which, if there's time, I'd just like to offer.
Please do.
About Western culture. I mean, One other factor that just comes to mind, I noticed when your piece about Andrew, you said at the end, you weren't sure whether he had dealt with the issue of migration.
Yeah.
Well, he did.
Okay.
It's in the third book that was edited by Martin Gornick. He has a chapter called Towards a Theology of Migration. And honestly, it's terrific.
Yeah.
It's terrific.
In self-defense, that article, the article was a repost of one that was written before his third book came out, I think.
Yeah, quite possibly. Oh,
Yeah.
well, almost certainly. Yeah.
Because that's
yeah.
very recent, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah. 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 Can I read a couple of sentences
Of
from
course
him?
you can.
This
Please
is
do.
his. He did what was called the Henry Martin Lecture. It was an annual thing for the Evangelical Missionary Alliance before it became Global Connections. I think this was in 1985. At the moment, Eddie, I'm trying to write something on the subject of mammon.
Oh.
So the provisional title is God or Mammon, Choice of the Century. And I don't know whether I'm going to be able to do it, but it's what I'm, it's filling my thoughts and my concern at the moment. And actually, it was when you asked me to do this today, I went back and reread this lecture, and I'd forgotten that he had said this. So you'll see how relevant it is. The problem is that Western Christianity has so far issued no clear call to repentance from the cult of Mammon. It is possible to accommodate his worship very well to the apparatus of church-going. It is possible to hold evangelistic campaigns that spell out the gospel in easy steps and never breathe a word about the false gods that hold Western society in thrall. It is not that the West is devoid of Christian witness, far from it. It is rather that Western Christianity has ceased to have critical contact with Western culture. It can no longer do it any harm or any good. Perhaps the voice that prepares the way of the Lord will next time be heard, not in the desert, but in the supermarket. It's typical Andrew, but it's absolutely to the point, I think.
Very much so. Just in closing, if I could gather together all of the leaders of British evangelicalism into one room, appropriately socially distanced, and you just had a couple of minutes to explain to them why they should engage with Andrew's work, what would you say to them?
I would say that I think he was the most original Christian thinker of my generation, especially in regard to the extremely difficult challenges of mission in a post-Christian culture. His grasp, his understanding of culture, his reading of scripture, the insights into his understanding of certain passages of the Bible, and the bringing of those two things together makes him someone who no one genuinely concerned with effective spread of the gospel in the context of our world today can afford to ignore.
No, I would very much agree. Thank you very much for that, David. I think that'll be very, very helpful it'll be a good reminder for folks who are aware of Andrew's work. And I think it will be an encouragement for those who don't to engage with him.
Sure.
And as you say, people need to.
Yeah, been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me.
You are more than welcome. And I look forward to the book on Mammon when it comes out.
Thank you. Thanks, Eddie. God bless.
Thank you.